Calaroga Shark Media.
July 6, 1809. The most powerful man in Europe kicked down the doors of the Quirinal Palace in Rome, stormed up the stairs, and personally arrested the Pope. Napoleon Bonaparte had just committed what Catholics would call the ultimate sacrilege, kidnapping the Vicar of Christ. Pope Pius the Seventh had been walking a tightrope with Napoleon for years. The little Corsican had already humiliated one pope, forcing Pius the Sixth to die in exile in French captivity. Now Napoleon was demanding that Pius join his continental blockade against Britain, close his ports to British ships, and essentially make the Papal States a French puppet. Pius refused. He was the spiritual father of all Catholics, he argued, including British Catholics. He could not take sides in a purely political war between European powers. His spiritual authority transcended national boundaries and political conflicts. This is White Smoke, Episode 35, The Prisoner Pope. Napoleon's response was swift and brutal. French soldiers surrounded the Pope's palace, arrested him in his nightclothes, and dragged him away to 5 years of imprisonment that would test the limits of papal authority and demonstrate the powerlessness of spiritual claims against military force. Today, we examine the most dramatic confrontation between papal and imperial power in modern history, when the man who claimed to be God's representative on earth became the prisoner of an emperor who recognized no authority higher than his own ambition. The relationship between Napoleon and the papacy had begun with mutual convenience and calculation rather than genuine respect or religious conviction. When Napoleon seized power in France through his coup of 18 Brumaire, he inherited a nation that had been torn apart by revolutionary anti-clericalism. Churches had been closed, priests had been murdered, and the Catholic faith that had defined French civilization for over 1,000 years had been nearly destroyed. Napoleon understood that lasting political stability required reconciliation with the Catholic Church that remained the spiritual anchor for most French citizens. Yet he also recognized that papal authority posed a potential threat to his own absolute power. His solution was the Concordat of 1801, a carefully crafted agreement that restored Catholic worship in France, while ensuring that the Church remained subordinate to imperial authority. The Concordat represented a masterpiece of Napoleonic manipulation. Pius the Seventh received formal recognition of Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, while Napoleon retained the right to appoint bishops and control church property. The Pope regained spiritual authority over French Catholics, but only within limits defined by imperial decree. For Napoleon, the Concordat served purely political purposes. He privately dismissed religion as superstition designed to control the masses, famously declaring that religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. Yet he understood the political utility of divine sanction for his rule, and was willing to manipulate papal authority to serve his imperial ambitions. The papal coronation of Napoleon as emperor in 1804 revealed the complex dynamics of their relationship. Napoleon demanded that Pius VII travel to Paris to crown him, seeking papal legitimacy for his usurpation of imperial title. Yet when the moment came, Napoleon seized the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, symbolically asserting that his authority derived from personal achievement rather than papal blessing. This theatrical gesture perfectly captured Napoleon's attitude toward papal authority, useful for legitimizing his rule among Catholic populations, but ultimately subordinate to his own imperial will. The Pope, who had traveled to Paris expecting to crown an emperor, found himself reduced to a ceremonial prop in Napoleon's self-aggrandizement. The relationship began to deteriorate as Napoleon's imperial ambitions expanded beyond France to encompass the entire European continent. His continental system, designed to destroy British commerce through economic blockade, required the cooperation of every European power, including the Papal States. When Pius refused to close papal ports to British shipping, Napoleon realized that papal independence posed an unacceptable threat to his grand strategy. Napoleon's demands escalated throughout 1807 and 1808. He wanted the Pope to expel British diplomats from Rome, confiscate British property in papal territories, and join the continental system as a full military ally. When Pius continued to assert papal neutrality, Napoleon began treating the Papal States as conquered territory, stationing French troops in Rome and imposing imperial administration on papal territories. Pius VII's resistance to Napoleonic pressure reflected both personal courage and institutional principle. Unlike his predecessor Pius VI, who had been overwhelmed by revolutionary violence, Pius VII possessed the diplomatic skill and moral authority necessary to defend papal independence against imperial coercion. Yet Pius also understood the theological implications of Napoleon's demands. If the Pope became a mere client of French imperial policy, papal spiritual authority would be compromised throughout the Catholic world. Catholics in nations at war with France would question papal neutrality and independence. The universal character of papal authority would be destroyed by subordination to any particular political power. The crisis reached its climax in June 1809 when Napoleon formally annexed the Papal States to the French Empire, declaring that the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, but he is not and cannot be a sovereign temporal ruler. This annexation represented the complete destruction of papal temporal authority that had existed for over 1,000 years. Pius VII's response was immediate and uncompromising. On June 10th, he issued the bull Quum Memoranda, excommunicating Napoleon and all those responsible for the annexation of papal territories. The spiritual leader of Catholic Christianity had declared war against the most powerful military leader in European history. Napoleon's reaction revealed both his contempt for spiritual authority and his understanding of its political power. Rather than dismissing papal excommunication as meaningless superstition, he ordered the immediate arrest of the Pope and his deportation from Rome. The emperor, who claimed to fear nothing, was sufficiently concerned about papal opposition to risk the scandal of imprisoning the head of the Catholic Church. The arrest of Pius VII on July 6 shocked Catholic Europe and demonstrated the complete subordination of spiritual to temporal authority in Napoleon's empire. French soldiers broke into the Quirinal Palace at dawn, found the Pope praying in his private chapel, and informed him that he was under arrest by order of the emperor. When Pius demanded to see the arrest warrant, he was told that Napoleon's word was sufficient authority. The Pope's journey into captivity became a symbolic pilgrimage that exposed the violence underlying Napoleonic claims to legitimate authority. Transported first to Grenoble, then to Savona, and finally to Fontainebleau, Pius was kept in comfortable but closely guarded imprisonment. While Napoleon attempted to break his resistance through psychological pressure, Napoleon's treatment of his papal prisoner revealed the emperor's sophisticated understanding of political manipulation. Rather than martyring Pius through harsh treatment, Napoleon provided him with adequate accommodation, while isolating him from all communication with the outside world. The Pope, who had excommunicated an emperor, was reduced to a comfortable but powerless captive. The isolation imposed on Pius VII was designed to force him into submission through psychological pressure rather than physical coercion. Cut off from his cardinals, deprived of reliable information about world events, and subjected to constant pressure from Napoleon's representatives, the Pope was expected to eventually accept imperial demands for the sake of peace. Yet Pius proved remarkably resilient under pressure. Despite his isolation and the constant stress of imprisonment, he refused to negotiate any agreement that would compromise papal independence or spiritual authority. His famous declaration that he would suffer everything for the Church became a rallying cry for Catholics throughout Europe who opposed Napoleonic domination. Napoleon's attempts to coerce papal cooperation became increasingly desperate as his military position deteriorated. The disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 and the formation of the Sixth Coalition against France made imperial control over Catholic opinion more crucial than ever. Yet the imprisoned Pope remained unmoved by imperial pressure. confident that his suffering served the long-term interests of papal authority. The Concordat of Fontainebleau, signed in January 1813, represented Napoleon's final attempt to legitimize his treatment of papal authority through negotiated agreement. Under enormous pressure and suffering from poor health, Pius VII initially accepted terms that would have reduced papal temporal authority while maintaining spiritual independence. Yet within weeks of signing the agreement, Pius repudiated the Concordat of Fontainebleau, declaring that he had been coerced into acceptance and that the terms were unacceptable to papal conscience. This repudiation demonstrated that even under the most extreme pressure, papal spiritual authority could not be permanently compromised through temporal coercion. Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig in October 1813 and the subsequent collapse of his empire finally freed Pius VII from captivity. The Pope's return to Rome in May 1814 was greeted by enormous crowds who saw his survival as divine vindication of papal authority against imperial tyranny. The imprisonment of Pius VII had profound implications for the future relationship between papal authority and European political power. The Pope, who had suffered for 5 years, rather than compromise papal independence, became a symbol of spiritual resistance to political oppression that would inspire Catholic opposition to secular authority for generations. Yet the confrontation between Napoleon and Pius also revealed the practical limitations of papal power in the modern world. The Pope, who claimed spiritual authority over all Catholics, had been rendered powerless by a single emperor's military force. Papal temporal authority, built up over centuries of careful political maneuvering, had been destroyed by imperial decree. The restoration of Pius VII to papal authority in 1814 did not restore the medieval synthesis of spiritual and temporal power that had defined papal authority for centuries. The Congress of Vienna returned most papal territories to church control, but the principle of papal temporal sovereignty had been permanently weakened by Napoleon's demonstration of its vulnerability to military force. More importantly, the Napoleonic captivity established precedents for future conflicts between papal spiritual claims and national political authority. The emperor, who had imprisoned a pope to serve French imperial interests, created a model that future rulers would invoke whenever papal authority conflicted with national policy. The prisoner pope's ordeal also transformed Catholic understanding of papal authority itself. Pius VII's suffering had purified papal claims of their temporal ambitions while strengthening their spiritual foundation. The Pope, who emerged from Napoleonic captivity, possessed greater moral authority precisely because he had been stripped of political power. The confrontation between Napoleon and Pius VII marked the end of the medieval papal monarchy and the beginning of the modern papacy's focus on spiritual rather than temporal authority. The Pope, who had been reduced to imperial prisoner, would inspire a new model of papal leadership based on moral authority rather than political power. Yet the imprisonment also demonstrated that spiritual authority, however exalted its claims, remained vulnerable to those willing to use physical force without moral restraint. The emperor, who recognized no law higher than his own will, had proven that papal authority could be neutralized by anyone sufficiently ruthless to ignore Catholic opinion and international scandal. The prisoner pope's legacy would endure long after Napoleon's empire had crumbled into dust, providing inspiration for Catholics who faced political oppression, while establishing the modern papacy's role as moral witness rather than temporal ruler. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration, but still written and produced by real podcasters, Mark Francis and John McDermott.